Hi, my name's Scott the Miniature Maniac, and today we're painting the highly secretive, debatably loyalist Dark Angels. What up, mini family? Welcome to the 6th installment of the Eavy Metal Marines series. If you're unfamiliar with the goals of this series, we're trying to achieve a look that is as close to the box art as humanly possible. That means this painting process is experimental and full of problem solving. The process demonstrated in this video is not meant to be used to paint entire armies, unless you're a masochist, and should rather be learned from. If you're unfamiliar with who Eavy Metal is, check out the first video in this series where we describe the characteristics that they employ. Now, without further ado, let's paint us a dark, moody boy. Apologies are in order as I have lost the footage of prepping and cleaning this model. Check out the Blood Angels video to see pretty much exactly what I did. I started with an undercoat of gray, mixing black and white Stynylrez primers. I wanted to use gray because I felt like my initial base coat would be neutrally impacted by gray, and I wanted the base coat to go on quickly and achieve exactly the color out of the pot. Sometimes white or black can have a tendency to impact your final base tone even after 10 layers. To see some experiments proving this, check out my base coating video. The next step was to base coat the model in Caliban green with my Sotar 2020. You can use whatever airbrush you own, or paintbrush. I use an airbrush because it's simply faster and I'm lazy. Next we're going to base coat all the cloth elements in Xandri Dust. After we get a nice opaque tone, we're going to then base coat the whole thing in Screaming Skull. We base coat in Xandri Dust first because it makes the following base coat much easier. If we were to base coat in Screaming Skull over Caliban green right away, it would take many layers of color to get an opaque tone. Painting with many layers can be tricky sometimes. You can get buildup in certain areas, even if you're being very vigilant. So, any amount of layers that we can reduce will help get a smooth base coat in our final product, which is a hallmark of the Eavy Metal style. Next, we're going to panel line the armor plates with Abaddon Black. Panel lining is the act of running a line in between each detail to cause visual separation. A more typical form of this would be using a wash, like Nuln Oil, but I find that washes don't produce as stark a line as pure Abaddon Black does. This step is meticulous and will make you want to pull your fingernails out, but it can really help to make all those armor plates pop out. It won't be so stark against Caliban green, but once we start adding edge highlights, it'll pop off. I swear, they added so many tiny little details to this model to be recess shaded just to make my life harder. The next stage is edge highlighting, and we're going to do 2 stages of it. Once with Warpstone Glow, and a second with Moot Green. Your line with Warpstone Glow shouldn't be the thinnest line you can achieve. You need to make it deliberately thicker so the second Moot Green line won't cover it up entirely, and you'll get a nice transition from Caliban to Warpstone to Moot. This is what really gives you that Tron-like look of edge highlighting. When you take a step back, the divide between those distinct layers start to blend together, and it makes it look like the edges of the armor are glowing. I also took some white and mixed it with some Moot Green and dotted it on in several places where various edges met at a 90-degree corner. A few lessons I learned from using these specific tones was that Warpstone Glow is a pretty weak color, and I was applying the paint almost entirely undiluted so I didn't have to repeatedly apply the edge highlights. Also, I like to work on the backpack last because I find myself rubbing the paint off of the edges on the backpack the most with my fingers, so I save it for last. If you need help with edge highlighting, I have a video dedicated to the subject that contains a few helpful hints.
In this video, we're shouting out Emerson Schaefer, Jay McKean, Silu, Tom Brown, David Long, Steve M, Crawfather, Corey Weigel, Tobias Asalaj, Half Acre of Fun, and Procor. Big thanks to all you guys who've become my patrons in the last month. I wish you guys the best of luck when we give away this mini at the beginning of May. Thanks once again to you guys for becoming my patrons. If you are curious about my Patreon campaign and the rewards that I have for it, you can find a link to it in the description below.
Next, we're going to work on the cloth portion. I'm starting with a wash of Seraphim Sepia diluted with Lamian medium in a 2-to-1 ratio of Seraphim to Lamian so that it doesn't color the Screaming Skull so intensely with that yellowish color. I'm taking my time to really avoid having the wash pool in unnatural areas, sponging it up with the brush. Another thing to be concerned about is that the wash likes to flow in the direction of gravity. So on vertical recesses, when you let something dry standing up, the color will be more intense toward the bottom of the recess. I experimented with this by letting my guy dry lying down so that my vertical lines were even in shade distribution and not affected during the drying time. This didn't work everywhere, so I had to come back in with some more Seraphim Sepia and apply it in other areas to make it look more natural. Next, we're going to do a progression of layers. Starting with Screaming Skull, we're going to apply layers of color to the more pronounced areas, the areas sticking out the most. Then we're going to gradually mix in more and more white into our Screaming Skull, layering it up more and more. I did approximately 4 different layers of color, getting brighter and brighter with each step. If you need help with layering, check out my layering video. Next, I worked on the metallic components of the miniature. I started by base coating the silver elements with lead belcher, followed up with a wash of Nuln Oil. I tried to target only the areas that had recesses to be shaded. I wasn't dousing the whole sword in Nuln Oil, just the part near the little sensor toward the hilt. Then I took Stormhost Silver, and on the smaller components I edge highlighted them. But on the flat of the sword I applied the silver like a layer, building it up towards the tip on one flat of one side, and then reversing that and building it up toward the flat towards the hilt on the other side. I wanted the shine to alternate. This is a very basic trick that a lot of people like to employ when doing non-metallic metal for the first time, but it also works when doing true metallic metals like we're doing right here. I also made sure to edge highlight the edges of the sword as well. To boost this effect even more, I took heavily diluted black ink and glazed the alternate side to the highlight to darken the shadows even more. Inks are great, especially for this application because they have a lot of shine, meaning that our silver paint beneath will still look shiny, whereas if we use something like Nuln Oil, it would dull our metallics. The gist of glazing is that you load up your brush with diluted ink, dab most of it off on a wet towel, and then apply the glaze toward the area that you want to be the darkest. In my case, it's the tip of the sword. Let each glaze dry and then focus more and more towards the tip with your subsequent layers, and you'll develop this nice, smooth, dark gradient. My black ink ran a little rampant, so I had to fix it up with some Stormhost Silver. Next, let's work on the gold portion, starting with a base coat of Retributor Gold, followed by a wash of Reikland Flesh Shade, and then highlighted these portions with Liberator Gold, followed by an edge highlight of Silver. Finally, on the plasma gun grip, I base coated them with Balthazar Gold, washed them with Nuln Oil, and then edge highlighted the model with Stormhost Silver. It's good to have a variety of metallic components on the model. The more details you pay attention to and differentiate between, the better end result you get. Next, we'll work on the face of the model, following Paul Norton step by step as laid out on his Instagram. We'll start with Kislev Flesh, wash it with Reikland Flesh Shade, and then layer it back up, starting with Kislev and progressively adding more and more white to the mix. Places that you want to target are the end of the nose, the eyebrows, the chin, and the cheekbones. Normally, you also want to do the forehead, but Zachariah's hood is covering most of it, so you don't need to worry about that. If you need help with finding places to highlight, using resources like Paul Norton's Instagram account can be very helpful as he shows you close-ups of the faces of his miniatures. Or it can be incredibly demoralizing because it's insanely good and you'll never live up to Paul Norton's standards. One day, Paul, one day! After the skin tones are done, we'll work on the eyes. This is simply a matter of base coating the eye in off-white and then dotting the pupil with black. Zachariah's eyes are a little bit easier to paint than the regular Space Marine because he only has one eye showing, meaning as long as you don't righteously mess up, there's no way for him to look like a total derp. Now on to the leather elements. We'll start with a base coat of Scourge Brown. After this, we'll do an edge highlight of Calthan Brown, followed up with a final edge highlight of Calthan and white mixed together. Next, we'll work on the red gun casing. First, we'll base coat in Mephiston red, paying attention to not get paint in the recesses of the gun casing, keeping them nice and dark. Next, we'll follow it up with an edge highlight of Fire Dragon Bright, followed by a mixture of white and Fire Dragon Bright together, targeting the sharp corners of the gun casing. Now on to the small details. The blue plasma coils I base coated in Thunderhawk Turquoise and edge highlighted with a mixture of white and Thunderhawk Turquoise. On smaller details like this, I don't find it's very beneficial to do more than 1 or 2 layers of color. Next, onto the Aquila, which many of you know how to pronounce accurately based on my last video. I started with a base coat of Graveyard Earth until it's nice and opaque. We'll then do a layer of Screaming Skull, leaving only the Graveyard Earth remaining in the deepest areas. Finally, we'll do an edge highlight of Skull White and call it done. Next, we'll do the purple line that runs around the perimeter of the inside of Zachariah's cloak. It's worth mentioning that these same tones and steps are used to paint the feather attached to the handle of his plasma gun. First, we start with Nagaroth Knight, drawing a nice thin line. Then on the area of the cape that sticks out a bit more and also where the lines meet in the corner of the robe, we'll apply some Warp Fiend Gray. Next, we'll add some white to the Warp Fiend Gray to apply a final layer of highlight. For freehand stuff like this, don't forget you can always come back with the base tone color, in this case Abaddon Black, and clean up the area where you messed up. I did this too so that my final line width was consistent across the whole cape. You also need to do this to the flap on the back of Zachariah as well. Next, I worked on the eyepiece. I started by base coating it in Abaddon Black and then Evil Sun Scarlet. I kept some of the black in the very top left portion of the circle. Then I applied some Fire Dragon Bright to the bottom right portion of the eyepiece. Finally, I took some Skull White and dotted the bottom right and top left portion of the eye to get a nice specular highlight. Onto the Purity Seal. I base coated with a 1-to-1 mix of Screamer Pink and Nagaroth Knight. Then, I added progressively more and more white to the mixture to get a highlight to pronounce the little ridges of the wax skull. Then, I took Shadow Gray and base coated the paper part of the Purity Seal, the one on the left and right side of Zachariah, and also the shoulder pad design. These all had a similar tone, so I banged them all out at the same time, because this scheme is efficient if anything, right guys? After this, I layered on Astronomican Gray, leaving only the smallest recesses still dark. I then finally added an edge highlight of Pure White. Then, on the Purity Seals, I took some diluted Abaddon Black and added some writing, holding my brush perpendicular to the seals. I also tried to write Soriel on the shoulder pad material as well. This is a matter of planning out your freehand so you don't run out of space, but also going back and forth with black and Astronomicon to clean up the areas where I mess up. I base coated Zachariah's little book in a 1-to-1 mixture of Lich Purple and Evil Sun Scarlet and mixed white into this mixture to produce an edge highlight. You might be saying to yourself at this point, this guy sure does a lot of mixing, but the reality is that mixing is a lot easier and a cheaper way to paint. I have all this paint sitting on my wet palette staying fresh over the course of this paint job, so it's really easy to grab it and mix it with various colors. I don't need to buy every single color, and also you'd be surprised at how consistent mixing looks when included in a paint plan for an army. Not that this is a paint plan for an army, but I wanted to refute that default argument that people use when talking about mixing. Okay, rant over, back to painting. Next, we'll work on the decorated knee pad. I paint the knee pad black first and then section it off into 4 quarters with Screaming Skull and base coat the top left and bottom right portions with Screaming Skull. I then took Codex Gray, which is slightly brighter than Ashen Gray, and edge highlighted the black portions of the knee pad and also the connecting joints in the palm, the hand, the armpits, the elbows, etc. After this, I edge highlighted the cream portions of the knee pad in Skull White, and finally painted the upper right portion of the knee pad in the same way that I painted the green armor, and this little detail was complete. Next, onto the handle of the sword and also the little buttons on his forearm. I base coated both of these details in Evil Sun Scarlet and did a little recess shading of the sword handle with Abaddon Black. I then took Kislev Flesh and edge highlighted both the button and the sword handle, and that's all. Finally, I did the little sword freehand on his shoulder pad. This is a pretty easy one to do. You first start by drawing a little red cross with Evil Sun Scarlet. Then you extend the left, right, and bottom leg of the cross into a diamond shape, getting wider in width toward the bottom of each leg. And you're done. Come back in with Abaddon Black to clean up your mistakes you might have made. Then glue on the head and make sure it's positioned right, and now it's on to the fun part, making the display base. I made this black cylindrical plinth in the same way as my previous Heavy Metal Marines video, so make sure to check that out to figure out how I get a nice, smooth, shiny plinth. I imagine dark angels in cathedrals all the time, so that's how I decided to paint and decorate my plinth. To start, I wanted a flat base. I grabbed my circle cutter and some plastic card and cut a disc out to act as the floor. I then cut a portion of the circle off because I wanted to attach a wall to act as a backdrop. I then struck some lines in the floor piece and with a triangle file widened those lines to simulate tiles on the floor. I did the same to the wall piece. I then scuffed it up with an X-Acto knife to make it look a little worn. You can barely see this because my gigantic head is getting in the way, but you're just gonna have to believe me. When it comes to base building, I get in the zone and the camera becomes expendable. I'm sorry. I then cut out a window shape in the wall portion. I wanted to make a stained glass window. I just kept cutting with a knife until it popped out. I then took a piece of acetate from the closest package that I had recently opened and superglued it to the back of the wall portion to act as my glass. Now comes the tedious act of trying to create a border on the window. I took tiny little strips of styrene and angled the edges where they would meet with sandpaper. I then heated them up until they were bending to match the curve of the window. This took several attempts until I got something workable. I tacked it in place with super glue and then bonded it permanently with plastic glue. You're gonna have to take my word for it. I then went to prime it, but realized I should have waited to put the acetate on until after the prime job. So I ripped it off and primed it, and then realized I should have put some dirt on before priming it, so I added some dirt in various areas where I think there should be buildup. I then painted it all a dark bluish gray. Then, with a lighter gray, I sprayed from afar with my airbrush. I wanted the particles to dry in the air before hitting the base so I'd get a speckled concrete look. Intentionally airbrushing with bad form for an effect, essentially. I then took some green tones and airbrushed them in places where moss or other plant-like material might start growing. I then took some brown color and sponged it on the base to muddy it up. Time for stained glass window round 2. I divided the section of the window with pieces of paperclip material and some super glue. I started to add some more various green tones on the base to liven it up a little bit. I then selectively hit the moss with a wash of Known oil. After this, I added some edge highlighting to the stonework with a light gray. I also added some scratches with this color. After the Known oil had dried, I dry brushed the mossy areas with a brighter, more electric green. Now on to actually painting stained glass. I took some old GW inks of various shades and painted them onto the acetate in several layers. I realized a little bit later that I should paint the back of the acetate instead of the front for a better effect, so I did that on the subsequent parts. Also, for better adhesion, I scuffed up the acetate with 1500 grit sandpaper. This helped the ink stick a lot better. I cleaned up the metal bars with some silver paint, and that was the window complete. I glued my Space Marine onto the base with pins and super glue and tied him to the base with some dry pigments, and that was this project done. I had a great deal of fun painting this mini, and I think this is the closest I've ever gotten to achieving the box art. What do you guys think? I think smaller projects like these with fun scenic bases are great opportunities for experimentation for your larger dioramas. These projects aren't so high stress and you can learn a lot of fun techniques with the freedom to mess up a little bit. If you guys are interested, I'll be giving this model away as part of my Patreon reward tiers. If you'd like to potentially win him, you can find the links in the description below. Thanks for checking out my video. If you want to check out more Heavy Metal Marine videos, I have them all collected in a playlist that you can find in a little eye in the top right hand corner of this video. If you want to support the channel, I have a t-shirt and a sticker for sale on my Redbubble account. Subscribe or die, and most importantly, don't forget to pay more minis! Recesses. This word is going to lose all meaning. Illegible. Fuck me. Illegible. It added some eligible. Fuck that word.